Over the past 2 years, official Vietnamese visits to Caracas have increased by 340%. The number of Venezuelan troops receiving asymmetric warfare training tripled in 2023. And in the Pentagon's 2024 Latin America Threat Assessment, the term Vietnam factor was used for the first time. This isn't just statistics, it's evidence of a transformation. Vietnam is quietly but systematically making Venezuela unconquerable for America. Hanoi's strategy is simple but effective. Turn Venezuela into a quagmire that the US will be too afraid to enter. And the numbers show it's working. CIA analysts now use the phrase second Vietnam scenario in their reports. What they fear is no longer a possibility, it's becoming reality. This is Crisis Chronicles, and today we're examining an alliance nobody's talking about, but everyone fears. A covert knowledge transfer pipeline running from Hanoi to Caracas, and why Pentagon generals are losing sleep at night. The story begins in late 2022. Venezuela is at the bottom of an economic collapse. The Maduro regime is internationally isolated. US sanctions are strangling the country. On paper, an easy target. Historians call this ripe target syndrome, when everything seems ready for intervention. Right at that moment, the Central Committee of the Vietnamese Communist Party in Hanoi makes an unusual decision, called the Strategic South Cooperation Program. Official documents describe it as agricultural cooperation, but the real purpose is completely different. In January 2023, the first team lands in Caracas. The 8-person group is officially registered as agricultural consultants, but among them are 3 retired Vietnamese generals. These aren't ordinary soldiers, they're men who served actively in the 1960s and 70s, fought against America, and won. And what they brought with them isn't modern weapons, it's experience. The first week, closed-door meetings are held with Venezuelan officers. What's on the agenda? Low-intensity conflict strategies, urban guerrilla tactics, asymmetric defense operations. These terms sound technical, but their meaning is simple: how to fight and win against a superpower. By March 2023, a new training program starts in the Venezuelan army. At Miraflores Military Academy, students now take mandatory courses on Vietnam War history. But the curriculum has an interesting feature. It's told entirely from the Vietnamese perspective. American strategic mistakes, Viet Cong tactical successes, techniques for winning popular support, psychological warfare methods. A Venezuelan colonel, keeping his identity hidden, later tells a journalist, "They taught us the Tet Offensive, not just the military dimension, the media impact, how an attack creates psychological effect, more than physical damage, how you exhaust the enemy's population, how you win the long war." In April, the CIA's Caracas station sends its first alarm report. The report notes that Venezuelan units are displaying abnormal tactical changes. Instead of traditional Latin American military doctrine, movements resembling Southeast Asian guerrilla tactics are being observed. May 2023, the turning point. A Vietnam Airlines cargo plane, landing at Simon Bolivar Airport, stays on the tarmac for 5 hours. The official cargo manifest says industrial equipment, but airport security cameras show metal crates being loaded onto military vehicles. What's in those crates? Weapons? Partially. But more importantly, training materials, videos, manuals, maps, simulation software. These materials are digitized archives of Vietnam's 50 years of war experience. How the Cu Chi tunnels were built, how the Ho Chi Minh Trail was protected, how air defense systems were positioned near Saigon. Every detail, every tactic, every mistake and success in digital format, now in Venezuela's hands. The Pentagon is monitoring these developments, but not taking them fully seriously yet, until late June. June 2023. A routine US-Colombia joint exercise is conducted on the Colombian border. The simulation scenario is simple: rapid assault operation against Venezuelan forces. American commanders expect an easy victory. After all, it's just a simulation. But something goes wrong. The blue team representing Venezuelan forces displays unexpected tactics: underground tunnel networks, decoy targets, coordinated ambushes, psychological operations. American units face resistance they never expected. The simulation lasts 2 weeks longer than planned, and in the end, no decisive victory is achieved. After the exercise, a senior American colonel writes in his report, "Enemy tactics did not conform to Latin American standards. They resembled Southeast Asian guerrilla doctrine, particularly North Vietnamese strategies from 1968 to 1972. This report sets off alarm bells at CIA headquarters in Langley. The analysis division springs into action, and the buried pieces start coming together. In July, the CIA establishes a task force, Vietnam-Venezuela Connection Assessment Team. The team's mission is simple: what's happening, who's talking to whom, what's being transferred. The findings are shocking. In the past 12 months, at least 23 Vietnamese military advisors have come to Venezuela, some for a few weeks, some permanently. Official records list them all as civilian consultants. But when their backgrounds are investigated, it turns out they all served in high ranks in the People's Army of Vietnam. Even more interesting, 3 of these advisors commanded the Cu Chi tunnels in the 1970s. 2 participated in the Tet Offensive. 1 coordinated air defense operations against B-52 bombings in 1972. So Venezuela isn't just receiving theoretical knowledge, it's learning directly from people who won the war. August 2023, at a military base in Maracay, Venezuelan Special Forces units enter 3 weeks of intensive training. The instructors are advisors from Vietnam. The program is titled Urban Asymmetric Defense, but the content is more about psychological warfare than defense. How to win civilian support, how to break enemy morale, how to use media, how to impose a long war. Each module is supported by concrete examples from Vietnam. One example is particularly emphasized, the 1968 Tet Offensive. Militarily, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong suffered heavy casualties, but in terms of media impact, it shattered the perception that the US was winning the war. Walter Cronkite's commentary on CBS transformed American public opinion. From that point on, the war became unwinnable. The message to Venezuelan officers is clear. You can lose the war on the battlefield, but if you win in the media, the outcome is in your favor. In September, the Pentagon's Southern Command goes on alert. Intelligence reports are now explicit. The Venezuelan army is undergoing structural transformation. It's moving away from traditional Latin American military doctrine. In its place, it's adopting an Asian-style asymmetric warfare model. October 2023, a secret meeting is held at the Pentagon. In the conference room are the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA Director, and key commanders. There's only one question on the table. What does a possible intervention in Venezuela look like now? The presentations are disturbing. War game simulations show scenarios far more costly than expected. The first weeks are easy. The US gains air superiority, secures key infrastructure. But then what? Urban guerrilla warfare, tunnel networks, resistance pockets impossible to eliminate, and most importantly, a long bloody occupation period. An analyst says in the presentation, in Iraq it took years to develop local resistance doctrines. In Venezuela, there's already a ready-made doctrine, and this doctrine comes from an enemy that beat us once. In November, a closed session is held in Congress. Topic: Latin America Security Threat Assessment. In the CIA director's presentation, the term Vietnam factor is used for the first time. The director explains, Vietnam is using Venezuela as a laboratory. Its own asymmetric warfare doctrine is being modernized and tested. If we intervene in Venezuela, we won't just be fighting the Maduro regime, we'll be fighting 50 years of Vietnamese war experience. December 2023. In Hanoi, the Vietnamese Ministry of Defense organizes a conference. Topic: Asymmetric Defense Strategies in the 21st Century. Among the participants are military delegations from 8 Latin American countries. Venezuela sends the largest delegation. The theses presented at the conference are clear. Small countries cannot win conventional warfare against superpowers. But in asymmetric warfare, geography, popular support, and patience balance against superior technology. Vietnam has proven this, and these lessons are transferable. January 2024. New year, new phase. Major reorganization begins in the Venezuelan army. The newly established Special Asymmetric Operations Command is directly subordinate to the presidency. The general appointed to head the command trained in Hanoi for 6 months throughout 2023. This command's mission is to execute a long resistance strategy in a possible U.S. intervention scenario. The plan is simple but effective. Accept losing the initial battles. But never give up. Withdraw to cities. Establish tunnel networks. Mobilize the population. Draw the enemy into a war of attrition. In February, at a military facility near Rio Chico, Venezuelan engineers receive intensive training on tunnel construction techniques. The instructors are again Vietnamese. Knowledge from the teams that built and managed the Cu Chi tunnels is now being applied on Venezuelan soil. These tunnels aren't just hiding places, they're designed to be command centers, weapons depots, hospitals, even small production facilities. But underground, resistance will continue. March 2024. The U.S. intelligence community presents its annual threat assessment to Congress. In the Latin America section, Venezuela has now been placed in the Tier 1 intervention risk category. The reason is clearly stated: externally supported asymmetric warfare capability. One section of the report is particularly striking. Venezuela's military capacity is weak by conventional metrics. However, its long-term resistance capacity has increased significantly due to external consulting and doctrine transfer. In intervention scenarios, initial success is likely, but the stabilization period may be longer than Iraq and Afghanistan. In April, U.S. Colombia military commanders meet in Bogota. Agenda: possible Venezuela emergency scenarios. The Colombian generals are concerned, because on the other side of the border, the army they knew is no longer there. There's something new, and nobody knows exactly how to deal with it. A Colombian general expresses his concerns at the meeting. The Venezuelans are talking differently now, planning differently. Their tactics are things we've never seen in our region. The Asian influence is very clear. May 2024. In a military parade broadcast on Venezuelan television, a strange detail catches attention. Some of the parading units are carrying equipment different from Latin American uniforms. When analyzed, it turns out to resemble Vietnamese Special Forces equipment. Even more interesting, in the opening speech of the parade, Maduro quotes Ho Chi Minh. "The war may last long, but victory is certain, because we are right and we are patient." In June, quiet panic spreads among Washington policymakers. Venezuela intervention scenarios are on the table, but every scenario reaches the same conclusion: easy entry, hard exit. July 2024. Rand Corporation prepares a classified report for the Pentagon. Title: Vietnam War Parallels in Venezuela Intervention Scenarios. The report lists chilling similarities. Geographic similarities: mountainous terrain, dense forests, cross-border sanctuary opportunities along the Colombian border, just like Cambodia and Laos. Demographic similarities: ideologically polarized population, urban-rural divide, social memory fed by anti-imperialist propaganda. Tactical similarities: underground networks, urban guerrilla warfare, long war strategy, emphasis on psychological operations. The most disturbing finding: if intervention occurs, the Maduro administration may collapse militarily within the first weeks. However, afterwards, a Vietnam-style resistance movement may begin. With regional and international support, this resistance could last 15 to 20 years. In August, the CIA issues a warning note: Hanoi-Caracas Asymmetric Knowledge Corridor. The note emphasizes that Vietnam is transferring not just tactics, but also strategic patience doctrine. Vietnam's message is simple: you don't have to win the war immediately. You just need to endure until the enemy admits defeat, and America is weak on patience. If the war drags on, internal political pressure increases. The media turns, public opinion gets tired. History has proven this. September 2024. At a military academy graduation ceremony in Caracas, newly graduated officers take an oath saying, "We will defend our homeland against all invasion, just like our Vietnamese brothers did. We will win the long war." The Vietnamese ambassador present at the ceremony applauds. And for the cameras to capture, Vietnamese and Venezuelan flags wave side by side. In October, the Pentagon conducts a new war game, codename Caribbean Quagmire. Scenario: full-scale intervention in Venezuela in 2025. The game lasts 3 weeks. 20 different sub-scenarios are played. The result? In 17 scenarios, the U.S. successfully takes initial objectives, but in 15 scenarios, 5 years later, an exit strategy still hasn't been found. Stabilization costs rise to 4 times initial estimates. The general directing the game says in the results presentation, "We compared with old simulations done without accounting for the Vietnam factor. In the new simulations, the duration and intensity of resistance doubled. The reason is clear: the opponent has learned." November 2024. At a National Security Council meeting, the president receives advice from his advisors. Intervention in Venezuela should only be considered in cases of absolute strategic necessity, because the potential cost exceeds the potential gain. An NSC member reminds, "When we entered Vietnam, we thought it would be easy too." In December 2024, an article is published in the Washington Post. Headline: The Pentagon's Venezuela Fear. A New Vietnam. The article is based on information obtained from confidential sources, and for the first time, the Vietnam factor is publicly revealed in popular media. Reactions to the article are mixed. Some analysts say it's exaggerated. Some find it realistic. But nobody at the Pentagon issues a denial statement, because they can't, because it's true. January 2025. A new year, a new assessment. In the CIA's annual World Threat Report, the Venezuela section has been significantly expanded, and one paragraph is particularly striking. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam continues to deepen military and strategic cooperation with Venezuela. This cooperation includes not just arms sales, but doctrine transfer, training programs, and strategic consulting. This development significantly complicates U.S. intervention scenarios in the region. February 2025. In Hanoi, the Vietnamese defense minister holds a press conference. Question: What stage is your military cooperation with Venezuela at? The answer is diplomatic but clear. We are in solidarity with all nations that historically struggle against imperialism. Venezuela is a sovereign country and has the right to strengthen its own defense. Journalists insist, "Are you afraid of U.S. intervention?" The minister smiles, "We do not fear, we have experience." March 2025. Near Caracas, a new military training facility opens. Its name, Ho Chi Minh Asymmetric Warfare Academy. The ceremony is attended by both Venezuelan and Vietnamese officials. The academy's curriculum is openly announced: tunnel warfare, urban guerrilla tactics, psychological operations, long war strategy, popular mobilization, and most importantly, methodology for victory against superpowers. In April 2025, the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee holds a closed session. Topic: possible military intervention options in Venezuela. The Defense Department representative says something striking in the presentation. "We're no longer just dealing with the Maduro regime, but with an ideology and doctrine. This doctrine beat us once, and now it's being revived. Entry into Venezuela may be easy, but exit? There's no guarantee." A senator asks, "So what do we do?" "Nothing." The representative answers, "We're evaluating our options, but we need to fully understand the cost of each option. And that cost is much, much higher than we initially thought." May 2025. An analysis piece appears in the New York Times. Venezuela, the preventable history of war. The piece examines how the Vietnam factor has influenced U.S. foreign policy. Conclusion: deterrence is working. But that's exactly what Hanoi wants. June 2025. Right now, here, today, Vietnam-Venezuela military cooperation continues. Every month, new advisors arrive. New training programs open. New tactics are shared. At the Pentagon, generals are still running simulations, still producing scenarios, still searching for solutions. But they can't find a solution, because what they're facing isn't a conventional army. It's history, it's experience, it's memory. And this memory was born 50 years ago in Saigon, as American helicopters fled from the embassy rooftop, as tanks broke through the presidential palace gates, and as the world learned that superpowers could be defeated. Now that lesson is crossing oceans, from the Mekong Delta to the Caribbean, from Saigon to Caracas, and America is facing the ghost of its own past. Because Vietnam isn't just selling weapons, it's selling victory, the knowledge of how to win, and most importantly, belief. The belief that superpowers can be defeated. This belief is more dangerous than the rifle itself. So what happens next? There are three possible scenarios. First, Washington backs away from intervening in Venezuela. The Vietnam factor becomes a deterrent. In this case, Hanoi will have won a strategic victory, the art of winning without fighting. Second, the U.S. intervenes but keeps it limited. Quick entry, quick exit. In this case, Venezuelan resistance won't be fully tested, but the threat perception becomes permanent. Every future crisis creates the same hesitation. Third, full-scale intervention, and the real test. In this case, the doctrine Vietnam transferred will be tested in practice. If it's successful, that is, if Venezuelan resistance drags the U.S. into a long, costly occupation, then the world changes. Because every small country, every regime under pressure, will learn this. If you learn from Vietnam, you can stand up to a superpower, and that's exactly what Hanoi wants, to turn its 1975 victory into an exportable model, to transform it from a historical event into a universal doctrine. Pentagon reports call this strategic knowledge diffusion. But the reality is simpler. This isn't revenge, it's survival. Vietnam knows that the way to secure its own existence is by teaching others resistance, because the more countries can resist America, the safer Hanoi is. The more the world's attention is scattered, the less pressure on Vietnam, the more maneuvering room against Beijing in the South China Sea. So Venezuela is a laboratory for Hanoi, but it's also a message to Washington, to Beijing, to Moscow, and to the entire world. Small countries are not defeatable, if they know the right strategy. Now let's look at the numbers again, because numbers don't lie. Between 2023 and 2025, Venezuelan officers' training trips to Vietnam increased by 420%, official diplomatic visits by 340%. The number of military advisors, according to figures not publicly available, rose from 0 to at least 35. The number of personnel receiving asymmetric warfare training in the Venezuelan army went from 150 in 2022 to 5,300 in 2025. All 6 newly opened military training facilities were established with support from Vietnamese advisors. In the Pentagon's Latin America intervention simulations, the average stabilization period estimate rose from 3 years in 2022 to 12 years in 2025. Expected costs were revised from $200 billion to $700 billion. These aren't just numbers. They're proof of how strategic calculations have changed. They're indicators that the Vietnam factor is really working. But the real question is, where will this cooperation stop? Because what we've seen so far may just be the beginning. Vietnam has much more knowledge it hasn't shared. More advanced tactics, more sophisticated strategies, deeper experiences. If the situation really turns into a crisis, if US intervention actually happens, then we'll see how thoroughly Vietnam has prepared. Some analysts think this. Vietnam is deliberately turning Venezuela into a trap, a sponge to absorb American military power, a well that drains resources, attention, and political will. If America enters Venezuela and gets bogged down, Vietnam's room for maneuver in its own regional interests opens up. It can be more aggressive in the South China Sea. As US regional presence weakens, Vietnam can strengthen its position. From this perspective, Venezuela isn't just an ally, it's a tool, a strategic tool. But there's another perspective. Maybe Vietnam is genuinely in ideological solidarity. Maybe Hanoi sees the struggle against imperialism as a universal duty. Maybe the 1975 victory is being preserved as an example not just for themselves, but for all small nations. The truth is probably a mix of both. Pragmatic interest and ideological belief are walking side by side. So how are American policymakers reacting to this situation? There are three camps. The first camp says, this is exaggerated. Venezuela's real military capacity is limited. Vietnamese advisors can help, but can't work miracles. If intervention is really necessary, the US is still the superior power. This camp's argument is simple. Technological superiority conquers everything. America's air power, intelligence capacity, logistical network, these are things Vietnam can't teach. The second camp holds the opposite view. This is extremely serious. Vietnam beat us and knows how it was done. If we go into Venezuela, we'll fall into the same trap. The cost is unacceptable. This camp's fear is history repeating. In the 1960s, it was also said it would be quick and easy. The result? 58,000 American deaths. A 10-year war. National trauma. The third camp is looking for middle ground. We should avoid intervention, but develop alternative strategies. Diplomacy, economic pressure, regional coalitions. Direct military intervention should be the last resort. This camp's strategy is patience. Wait for the Maduro regime to collapse from within. Create cracks in the Venezuelan military. Minimize risk without neutralizing the Vietnam factor. So far, the third camp appears dominant. But this can change. A single event, a border clash, a humanitarian crisis, a regional threat, can reverse all calculations. And Venezuela is aware of this situation. The Maduro government is using the Vietnam card as a diplomatic shield. At every crisis moment, Caracas emphasizes solidarity with Hanoi. The message is sent. We are not alone. There's a power supporting us, training us, teaching us, and this power beat America. This rhetoric works in both domestic and foreign policy. At home, it gives morale to regime supporters. We can resist. We can win. Abroad, it sends a message to potential aggressors. You will pay the price. But this strategy has its risks. Because the more it relies on Vietnam, the more dependent it becomes. And will Hanoi always prioritize Caracas's interests? Uncertain. Vietnam has its own agenda. South China Sea, economic growth, regional stability. If Venezuela harms these agendas, Hanoi may withdraw support. So Maduro is walking a tightrope, a delicate balance between using the Vietnam factor and becoming completely dependent on it. Now let's look at a broader picture. Because this isn't just a matter between two countries, it's part of a global trend. Worldwide, small countries are developing asymmetric strategies against superpowers. Iran, with its nuclear program and network of regional proxies. North Korea, with nuclear deterrence and intense propaganda. Russia, with hybrid warfare and cyber operations. And now Vietnam, by exporting its own experience, is contributing to this trend. Every successful transfer legitimizes its doctrine. Every resistance story strengthens its model. If Venezuela succeeds, that is, if Vietnam-style tactics really deter the US, then other countries will want to adopt the same model. Resistance groups in Myanmar, insurgents in the Philippines, maybe some movements in Africa. Vietnam will have created the franchise of asymmetric warfare, a know-how exporter. The apple of resistance knowledge. This is the Pentagon's nightmare of nightmares, because you have to fight not a single enemy, but a methodology, and destroying methodologies is much harder than defeating armies. So how does China view this development? Beijing looks at Vietnam-Venezuela cooperation with mixed feelings. On one hand, America getting stuck in Venezuela serves China's interests. US attention in the South China Sea gets diverted, but on the other hand, Vietnam acting this autonomously makes Beijing uncomfortable, because Vietnam is China's regional rival. If Hanoi becomes a powerful actor in global military consulting, this could threaten China's regional hegemony. Also, Beijing is Venezuela's biggest creditor. $60 billion is at stake there. If the situation destabilizes, that money is endangered. So China is watching events carefully, but avoiding direct involvement. It prefers to stay in the shadows. Russia is more open. Moscow supports the Vietnam factor in Venezuela, because every resource America pours into the Caribbean flows away from Ukraine, the Middle East, elsewhere. Russia is also developing its own asymmetric doctrine, hybrid warfare, information operations, cyber attacks, and the combination of Vietnam's classic guerrilla tactics with Russia's modern hybrid methods could create a powerful cocktail. So Venezuela is becoming not just a bilateral relationship, but the stage of a multipolar geopolitical game. And Europe? What do NATO allies think? Most European countries don't support American intervention in Venezuela. The Iraq and Libya experiences created intervention fatigue in European public opinion. Also, Europe doesn't see Venezuela as a direct threat. Even the refugee crisis mostly stays in Latin America, doesn't reach the Mediterranean. So if the US goes into Venezuela, it will likely be alone, maybe limited support from Colombia and Brazil. But a broad coalition from NATO partners? Unlikely. This also resembles the Vietnam scenario, because in Vietnam too, America became increasingly isolated. Allies quietly distanced themselves, public opinion pressure increased, and eventually it had to withdraw. Now let's return to the beginning. With all this information, what does the big picture show? Vietnam defeated a superpower, and it hasn't forgotten how it did it. Now it's using that knowledge as a strategic tool. Venezuela was the first major test site for this tool. The result? We don't know yet, because the real test hasn't come yet. But the preparation phase is complete. If the US intervenes, Venezuela is ready. Tactics have been learned, doctrine has been internalized, will has been strengthened, and the Pentagon knows this. But knowing isn't a solution. Because the problem isn't lack of knowledge, it's a strategy contradiction. America is an army designed for quick victories, but Venezuela is preparing for a long war. America relies on technological superiority, but Vietnam taught that superiority of will is stronger than technology. How do you solve this asymmetry? There's no easy answer. And here's the most ironic part. Vietnam is currently on good terms with America. Trade is increasing. Diplomatic cooperation is expanding. In the South China Sea, there are even common interests. But the same Vietnam is teaching a potential enemy of America how to fight against it. How do you explain this contradiction? The answer is realpolitik. Vietnam trades with America because it has economic interests. But it helps Venezuela because it has strategic interests. The two policies don't exclude each other. On the contrary, they balance each other. Hanoi doesn't want to be either America's close friend or enemy. It wants to stay in an ambiguous space between the two. This ambiguity provides maneuvering room, and America has to live with this, because it can't declare Vietnam an enemy. It needs it against China, but it can't fully accept it as a friend either. After seeing what it's doing in Venezuela, this is the ambiguity of 21st century geopolitics. No definite friendships and enmities, only temporary alliances and conflicts of interest. So what should we, as viewers, learn from this? First, history teaches. Vietnam turned its victory from 50 years ago into a strategic asset today. Past experiences can become future power. Second, being small doesn't mean being weak. If you know the right strategy, you can stand against much larger enemies. Third, knowledge is more powerful than weapons. The most valuable thing Vietnam transferred to Venezuela isn't rifles, it's know-how. Knowledge of how to think, how to plan, how to resist. Fourth, patience is a strategic weapon. Vietnam didn't try to win hastily. It resisted for years, waited, exhausted, and eventually won. Now it's teaching the same philosophy to others. Fifth, every superpower has limits. America is a tremendous military power, but it's not limitless. If it faces determined resistance and a long war, victory isn't guaranteed. Now let's look ahead. What should we expect in the next 6 months? First indicator, political developments in Venezuela. If the Maduro regime starts collapsing from within, the Vietnam factor won't be tested. But if it solidifies, the likelihood of conflict increases. Second indicator, U.S. domestic politics. Election periods affect foreign policy decisions. Intervention in Venezuela is a high-risk political gamble. Who wants to take that gamble? We'll watch. Third indicator, regional dynamics. Colombia, Brazil, Mexico. These countries' positions are critical. If there's regional support, intervention is easier. If not, America is alone. Fourth indicator, China and Russia's moves. How long will Beijing and Moscow continue supporting Venezuela? If they withdraw, the situation changes. But for now, support continues. Fifth indicator, a crisis moment. Conflict usually isn't planned. It's triggered. A border incident, a humanitarian disaster, a diplomatic breakdown. This kind of event can upend all calculations. And ultimately, this story's lesson is simple but profound. War isn't won just with weapons. It's won with strategy, will, patience, and knowledge. Vietnam proved this in 1975. Now it's turning that proof into a product, an exportable doctrine, a copyable model. Venezuela became the first major buyer of this model. But it may not be the last, because in the world, there are dozens of countries standing up to superpowers, under pressure, facing the threat of annihilation. And they're all asking one question: how do we survive? Vietnam's answer: learn from us. We won. You can win too. This message is what keeps Washington awake at night. Because if every small country takes this lesson, being a superpower loses its old meaning. Power isn't just the number of warships, it's the will to win the long war. And if you can teach that will, you can multiply power. Vietnam did that, and the Pentagon hasn't found a counter-strategy yet. This is Crisis Chronicles. We analyze world tensions, secret alliances, invisible strategies. If you don't want to miss analyses like this, subscribe to our channel, because the Vietnam-Venezuela story isn't over yet, and we'll see together how it ends. In the next episode, we'll cover Taiwan Strait tensions. How is the balance between China, the US, and regional powers maintained? How close is a conflict? All questions, all scenarios. In the next video, what are your thoughts? Let's discuss in the comments. Does the Vietnam factor really work? Should the US intervene or not? What do you think? This is Crisis Chronicles. Stay informed.